Now, I want to talk today about the rule of law, Ms. Petty said, through the lens of culture and class. The rule of law serves as the foundation of a civilized society. It establishes transparent and universally accessible processes to ensure that people who are affected, people who interact, people who receive the benefits or suffer the burdens are treated equally. That's the goal. Sometimes we achieve it. In the minds of some people, we will say, they will tell you that they don't. And the reason I wanted to talk about it through the lens of class and culture, because when I define culture, it includes the race, ethnicity, the other groups like the mentally ill, incarcerated persons. All of that is a part of culture. It includes the various ethnic groups that we're all a part of. And when we look at that concentric circle, it sort of binds all of us together. And we know that age and sexual orientation, and all of that comes under that big culture umbrella. And when we talk about class, I'm talking about that primarily from a socioeconomic perspective, because there are issues that are unique to people who are in that socioeconomic class that is below a certain timeline. And in courts, we have a particularly often difficult time ensuring that certain groups of people receive the same quality of justice as others. Brian Stevenson has said on more than one occasion that in these United States, it is better to be rich and guilty than poor and innocent. And people see justice playing out differently across these various groups. I think I told you before that now about 7 decades ago, an organization called the National Conference of Christians and Jews did a survey. They wanted to understand people's satisfaction and people's belief in the fairness of court outcomes. And so they surveyed 4 major groups. You will not be surprised to know that American Indians or Native Americans were not included in that survey at that time because the surveyors thought the numbers were statistically insignificant. And so they surveyed whites, African Americans, Latinx people, hey, Chloe, Latinx people, and that in the survey, they identified them as Hispanics. And they surveyed Asian Americans. And what they found was that of that group, only whites believed that they could get a fair outcome in courts, be it civil or criminal. African Americans overwhelmingly believed that they could not get a fair outcome. Latinx people, or as the survey said, Hispanics, had some concerns about the ability to achieve fair outcomes, but theirs were not as high as African Americans. Some Asian Americans where they had greater confidence than did the Hispanic group. That's a problem for all of us, whether we're a student, faculty, judge, lawyer. It's a problem because the courts have no way to enforce their orders, their judgments, except through people's confidence in the integrity of the process. So, while the rule of law serves as a foundation for a civilized society, by establishing these transparent laws, people still believe that maybe that is not being accomplished, that maybe the people on the bench are not enforcing this or deciding these things in an equal and just, consistent way. Now, I say that today, the term rule of law has almost been reduced to a bumper sticker. It's got certain cachet, but I don't believe that we as Americans share a common definition of the rule of law. Yes, what I'm going to give you is sort of a formulistic definition that comes from, what I'm going to give you comes from the World Justice Institute. But everyday people, when you ask them what they mean, what they think the rule of law means, they're going to give you varying definitions, and part of that definition is going to vary based on their vantage point. You know, all of us can have changing perspectives depending on how close or how far removed we are from whatever the problem or the issue is. It's going to change. But the rule of law depends largely on having strong written laws, which were adopted through established procedures. And later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that Patty does about voting, because voting and the access to voting is the greatest preserver of all rights, because there is accountability at the people-to-people level. But this principle of rule of law provides an important safeguard against arbitrary government actions. It's a predictable legal system with fair, transparent, and effective judicial institutions, and that is essential to protecting citizens against the arbitrary use of power and authority. So these strong, stable written laws must be applied uniformly to all people, regardless of their position in society. And we see time and time again where there are variances in that application. Under the World Justice Institute definition, it says that laws the rule of law means laws that are reduced to writing, they're publicly available, and as much as possible, widely understandable. It says that the absence of retroactive laws and laws that apply only to particular persons or classes would be antithetical to the rule of law. Rule of law also means judicial accountability and transparency, and it means judicial review by an independent and impartial judiciary. So to put it differently, the rule of law contemplates that government's decisions are made according to written rules and laws, and that they're applied uniformly to all people at all times. There's not some flexible standard for certain groups and certain people. And so you don't have things like arbitrary arrest, long detentions without a hearing. You don't have disenfranchisement at the ballot box. You don't have disparate punishment for people based on race or class, whether that is intentional or whether it's just the impact. Now, we know that this patchwork of bail systems that exist around the country oftentimes leads to results that don't look a lot like the definition of the rule of law. And we also know that poor people overwhelmingly spend more time pre-trial in jails and prisons than any other group, because they don't have the access to the money or the resources to get released. Why does that matter? Well, there have been studies that say that people who do not get pretrial release disproportionately are found guilty or they plead guilty. And they do that to get out of jail. Case in point, many of you may have heard of a book called Never Far From Home. It was written by Bruce Jackson, who is now the Associate General Counsel of Microsoft. He tells a story about being 10 years old. And he was in New York. He was getting ready to take the train to his grandmother's house for dinner, I believe it was. And while standing there waiting to board the train, there were officers who looked at him and said, "There he is." And when he saw them pointing, the instincts of a 10-year-old are to run. And he ran. And he darted in and out of around train cars. And when he came out at what he thought was a safe place, the officers asked him, were they waiting for him? And they took him to the jail. And they questioned him. They told him that he had robbed someone. He kept saying he didn't do it. And they said, "We know you did it. Just tell us that you did it and you can go home." And he persisted in saying, "I did nothing." But he said, finally, even though he knew he had done nothing, the desire to be able to go home kicked in. And he was almost at the point of saying, "I did it just so he could go home." His mother, his uncle came, and his mother looked at him and asked him, "Bruce, did you do it?" And he said, "No, I didn't." So she got him a lawyer, And he went home. Well, they made bail at first, but then she did get a lawyer. But by the time, shortly after she got the lawyer, the investigators at the police department found the person who actually done the robbery and confirmed to them that Bruce was in fact innocent. But you know, he talks about so many people entering the system, disproportionately Black and brown people, especially because of poverty. Because when they're there and they can't make bail, if there is a lever that they can pull and go home, instinct is to grab for that lever and to go home. And then that initial entry into the system can lead to returns to the system. So Bruce now is assistant general counsel at Microsoft, making a ton of money, doing multi-million-dollar deals. And he said, Bill, even since that time, he has been arrested and spent a night in jail because his mother still lives in that same community, and he goes to see her driving a fairly fancy car. And with him being behind the wheels of that fancy car, it's not a Tesla like Chris's, but it's a fancier car. But Chris's car is quite fancy, I'm just telling you that. But he has been stopped because him being, by virtue of him being behind the wheel of that car and in that neighborhood, there is a suspicion that he obtained that car for illegal means or the illegal proceeds, and that he is engaged in unlawful and nefarious activity. And he's talked to his colleagues, and they said, surely that didn't happen to you. But he points out that there is still a disparity in treatment and oftentimes police outcomes. And he confirms that oftentimes the blanket of the rule of law doesn't fall evenly on all people, at least in the very initial encounters. And there are more encounters for police and citizens of color, people in communities of color, than there are between police and groups not of color. So while the situation in the court might be free of bias and class, may not count, culture may not count. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it may not. At least in that initial encounter, there's a huge issue that looms large and can result in some pretty significant negative outcomes. So, if that's the case, a fair, learned, and independent judiciary is critical because we who wear the black robe are supposed to ensure that justice is administered evenly and fairly to all persons coming into court. That study I told you about 70 plus years ago was replicated within the last 20 years by the Pew Foundation. And they covered the 4 groups plus American Indians. And the results were pretty much the same. Citizens of color don't have a reasonable expectation that they consistently will get fair and just outcomes in courts. And that is an indictment, not just on judges, but on each one of us, because all of us are the guardians of justice and of fairness and of equality. And I want to remind you, we have been in this struggle for a long, long time. I was a bankruptcy judge, but sometimes math doesn't come easily, and I'm not going to make any stereotypes, but it just doesn't. I think though we are at about the 160th year after Abraham Lincoln and his Gettysburg Address after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Okay, well, we're not, but it's been a long time, okay? And so that was immediately after, the legal end of slavery. This is 2023. Remember the People's Campaign, the Poor People's Campaign led by Dr. King in Washington, D.C., where he was advocating for economic justice. for equality, for fair treatment, for inclusion. Now, we didn't use all the buzzwords we're using now, but he talked about people being an heir to the liberty and equality that was expressed in our founding documents. And he said, you know, there's a problem. And he also talked about an urgency. You know, we may not speak every day about that urgency, but we know it's still there. And there are people who are feeling like they are not woven into the fabric of justice and equality, that they are some of those loose threads. And we have to be concerned about that. And as Patty mentioned, there are a lot of programs around the country through organizations like the ABA that are working to try and mend that. And we all, you know, my cousin used to say that we can't live any better than we know. But once we know better, we're obligated to do better. And I think most of us would agree with that. I will just slightly take a slight diversion, because the ABA is the voice of the legal profession. The tagline says that we have over 400,000 members, and we see ourselves as the umbrella organization, the voice of the legal profession. But the ABA has traveled the distance since its founding. And there's an organization called the National Bar Association, which is an organization of African American lawyers, founded in 1925. Why was that founded in 1925? Because at that time, the ABA, the American Bar Association, did not admit African American lawyers. They admitted one, but they didn't know he was African American. So once they found out, they expelled him. And so, because African American lawyers couldn't join, they formed their own organization, and they still exist today. And even if it were not the case that people couldn't join, there are other affinity bars, NAPABA, the Native American Bar Association, NABA, the NAPABA, the Asian lawyers, and there are those for Middle Eastern lawyers, and just a whole range of things. But we are striving to come together as one, but still maintain identity and affinity. So let me get back to the grown-up talk now. This independent judiciary that must make sure that everyone coming into the courts receives a measure of fairness. Now, the students that I talked to before, you've heard this, so if you want to just check email or whatever, feel free to go ahead. You know, I became a judge, as Patty told you, the first elected African-American female judge in Tennessee's history. And when I was elected judge, no one had seen anybody who looked like me, because we sort of didn't have judges on TV, I mean, African-American judges especially. And so the clerk of court staff, my courtroom, he wanted to make sure that I had everything I needed to be successful. He was a middle-aged white male. His name was Gene Goldsby. And Mr. Goldsby was a wonderful, wonderful man. He really was invested in my success. Problem, he didn't talk to me about what I needed or wanted. And so when I finished my ceremony the morning of September 1, 1982, and they cleared the courtroom and swept the floor and all that jazz, that afternoon I had a docket, traffic docket, 4-person docket. Mr. Goldsby staffed my courtroom as follows. There I was in my black robe, seated in an elevated position. Right below me were my 2-minute clerks, an African-American female to my right, an African-American male to my left. The prosecutor standing on the floor at a 45-degree angle, an African-American male, and the security team reading the courtroom. 1 African-American female, 3 African-American males, each with a standard issue Smith & Wesson weapon strapped to their side. The first person to come into that courtroom was a young white male. He walked in. He looked around. His eyes grew quite wide as he looked around and saw no one in that room who looked like him. And he came to the bench and requested a continuance. And I granted that. 30 days later, he came back with an African-American defense attorney. Now, that may have been the attorney he was going to hire anyway, Joel. I don't know. But I suspect he was trying to make sure that he created a situation for himself to ensure that he could get justice that was fair and unbiased. Think about people of color who have gone into courtrooms all over this country and rarely saw someone in the system who looked like them. But all of us must be concerned that every citizen who comes into the court believes that they have gotten a fair outcome. And that's why diversity, equity, and inclusion is so important. It doesn't matter whether that Patty goes before a judge who is an American Indian or Native American, but there must be people in the system. The courts ought to reflect the diversity of the community. It doesn't have to be by the same ratio, but there must be people in that system. Because when people know that the system is diverse, they believe that there are people there who share the same values and interests as they do. And that becomes important. That gives them greater confidence in the justice outcome.
You're assigning all the same values.
In that instance, I don't want to leave that story hanging. After that experience, I went to Mr. Goldsmith and I thanked him for caring about me, for being concerned about my needs. But I told him, we need to create some diversity in the courtroom. And we changed out 2 of the court personnel. Remember I told you we had 3 African-American deputies. So we took 3 African-American males. We took out 2 of the African-American males, brought in 2 white males. One, Joey Hadley, who had been a boxer, and Joey became my great friend throughout my career. And those people had nothing to do with the adjudicative function, nothing. But their very presence in that courtroom seemed to make a difference. Just the facial diversity in the courtroom helped, I believe, people believe that they could come into that courtroom and there was somebody there who could relate to them. So in our environments, one of the things we talk about is the need for diversity at all of the levels of the process. Now, I'm going to tell you, I talk about outcomes with law enforcement. Judges don't go out and arrest people. Judges don't do the prosecution. They don't get involved in the plea agreements, all that kind of stuff. But we bring our experiences and our whole selves to the process. And we look at facts, we being the judiciary, in all of its diversity. Having many judges with different backgrounds can help, I believe, that process. You'll notice that in the federal system, under President Biden, he has gone out of his way to make certain that there is a richness of diversity in his appointees. I don't just mean racial and ethnic diversity, but professional diversity. For the first time, there have been people who come from a public defender background going on the Court of Appeals and on district courts. In the past, that just didn't happen. Government employees couldn't look to have the possibility of going on a lifetime federal position. But he appreciates the need for having professional diversity or experiential diversity. Persons with disabilities, persons with different sexual orientations. All of that is in the mix because that is who we are as a people. If I were to ask you in this room today, before I started this talk, if I'd ask you to tell me what an American looks like, none of you could tell me because there is no singular profile of an American. I used to give talks to students when I first came on the bench, and I took requests to speak somewhere everywhere, and one of them was an elementary. I guess it was sort of like it's that grade that they go to right before they start formally elementary school. So I went out there, the teachers, the kids who still love the teachers and they hug the teachers' knees, because that teacher is an authority figure. So I was trying to explain to them about diversity. And I thought, these kids are not going to know, they're not going to have anything to relate to. And then I thought, soup. So I asked them, how many of you like green pea soup? Raise your hands. It must have been, more than 100 kids in the room, but a couple of hands went up. So I asked them, how many of you like potato soup? A few more hands went up, and then I went into tomato soup, and more hands went up. And when I asked them, how many of you like vegetable soup? Pretty much every child in the room raised his or her hand. And I told them that diversity is like a lot like vegetable soup, because each individual vegetable, just on its own, it has a special and distinct flavor. But when you mix various and different vegetables, each one of them contributes their own zest, their own flavor to the soup. And that diversity amongst us is a lot like vegetable soup, because we all bring our unique experiences and we put them in the mix, and then we're richer and better because of that. I thought it was kind of a hokey example, but when I thought about it, I thought, yeah, that's kind of right. Because we do. We don't share our lived experiences just because we become a lawyer, just because we become a judge or a faculty member. And I know that with many of the issues that we face and we talk about, it becomes difficult for faculty perhaps to talk about some of those with their students, because, people bring those lived experiences. They bring those questions they've wondered and thought about in the classroom. They bring the what ifs into the classroom. And the teacher, the professor who is the authority figure, I guess that's still the case, Patty, I don't know. But they're expected for you to have an opinion or to know something about that. And some of these things are controversial, and we have to not shy away from those things that are uncomfortable, that may sometimes be controversial. But we have to make certain that every person is heard and that they have an environment where they're comfortable bringing up the uncomfortable. Because I tell you, it is time out for pretending not to know what we know and not to see what we see. And we have to make certain that people who otherwise have no voice are heard, and that the people who are present are seen and not viewed as invisible. And we have had a huge issue over time with the invisibility of certain people. They're there, but we choose perhaps not to see them. Now, I want to go back to, as I get very close, I mentioned I would talk about voting. But first I want to just mention a word about access to justice. There's a huge access to justice gap. We have a very expensive justice system. And so many people do not have the means to access that, but yet our governing laws and our Constitution applies to all of us. And so we have to make a way for people who don't have the means to access that justice. Legal services organizations can't do it all. Many states have passed, many states through their Supreme Courts have created obligations for lawyers to provide pro bono service. Many schools have created clinics for to help people who otherwise can't afford it to get access. And we've got to further those efforts. But we've also got to create a culture where people can, through employment and other issues, can perhaps elevate their situation in the overall justice system. Everybody's not going to get there, because we have people who have, we have large issues with people who are mentally ill, people who are reduced to second-class citizenship because they've been arrested or convicted. We have people who have, whatever the situation is, who are not going to be able to just walk up and access that system. But we cannot forget them and we cannot leave them out. So I challenge you, the new young people who are coming out, to make certain that you are cognizant of and that you find ways to create greater access to justice for marginalized groups and for otherwise excluded groups. Voting is a huge issue. I told you before that voting protects all other rights, but we have a lot of people who are either voluntarily opting out or who are legally being pushed out. One of the groups that I want you to be mindful of, because there are issues across the states about how states deal with and treat people who have been convicted of a crime, who served their time. Many of them you have to go through an arduous process to regain that right to vote. And in some states, I think there were just two of them where they, essentially can't get it back. And that may have changed some now. But those are individuals who are citizens, but they've been reduced to a separate and secondary, a third class of citizenship. And we have to be mindful of those. There are people today, though, where those in authority are intentionally creating barriers to access to the voting booth. We know that we've had cases like one man, one vote. We have had drives for people to register and become involved in the democracy. But now we're seeing that we are, instead of making this accessible across the board, we're suspicious of our neighbors. And we're trying to say, prove that you have earned the right, prove that you can justifiably exercise the franchise. And so people like Patty and others who are out in the fields trying to make sure that we expand voting rights, that we protect them, and that we include people across the board in the benefits of democracy. I want to leave you, and I don't know what time, how am I doing on time, Patty?
You are doing great on time.
What does that mean?
So it's 12:50, so you have you can talk for 10 more minutes and we can do some Q&A.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you. I had no idea that I've been talking that long. So one final thing, one final area that I really want to talk about, and that is children. I want to say there's a crisis right now across the country related to children. And what we do with children is going to define how they become adults, if they become adults. There is massive mental health issues that children are facing, and we're not creating the capacity to address those. We as a country have decided to put massive dollars on the back end and limit dollars on the front end when it comes to children. Children are the victims of, so much trauma in many instances, whether it's trauma of being hungry, trauma of seeing violence, and we now know that if children see violence visited upon them, there is secondary trauma that they experience. We all know about these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences that can define a person's life trajectory even when they become an adult. And so we have got to make mental health more available. Even though we are all these years after Brown, schools are not equal. Oftentimes, inner city schools in many communities are underfunded. I used to go around and visit schools, and I would go to some schools in really poor communities, and the children would be issued a textbook. They might lose it or whatever, or something else might happen to it, and they could not get another one unless they paid for it. And sometimes parents were poor, and they could not pay for another. I went to another school where children had 2 sets of each textbook, one for home and one that they would leave at the school, so they didn't have to carry those heavy books on their back. They had a set at home to prepare from, and then a set at school to use it. But that was not uniform across the county. So it's issues like that kind of disparity that we need to deal with. Also, the issue of the internet or broadband, and I'm way out of my depth now, but I do know that many, and this became manifest in the era of COVID. Children did not have often homes that had internet, and they could go to the library and use the internet, but transportation was not available to them. And so we're starting off with kids not being able to be ready to move to the next level and to learn at grade level because of barriers to entry. So why do I say, why I mentioned that today on the rule of law issue and a rule of law lecture? It's because of this. Dr. King said that our destinies, and the our means all of us, our destinies are inextricably intertwined. When we don't address these issues on the front end, we will face them and fear them on the back end. So those of us who are lawyers, we have been trained to argue. We've been trained to write laws. We've been trained to be lawyers and to present issues. We know how to do these things. And so in our communities, when we have an opportunity to help point out deficiencies, disparities, needs, we need to be able to do that so that we can help move this country to justice for all. I promise you, these are my final words. Dr. King again said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And then we know that it doesn't bend of its own volition. It doesn't bend because of any gravitational force. It bends because men and women of commitment, men and women of conscience, men and women of vision put their hands firmly against the arc and they push and they pull it in the direction of justice. And only through the efforts like that do we finally get there. It's been a long time, we're still not there yet. But I believe that we all will get to that justice mark. But there are barriers. And one of the barriers that keeps us from getting there, things like implicit bias. And that's what the book is about. And there are efforts like this all across the country to help eliminate bias. I don't mean racism, prejudice. I don't mean things like that. I mean the way our brain works, the choices that our brain, I say choices, how our brain categorizes information, the data set that's created in our brain, the lens through which we view life experiences, actions of others, words of others, all of those things make up that bias that we talk about. So I want to thank you all for bringing me here to talk to you about rule of law. And I hope that we do one day get to, in my own view, a shared definition of rule of law, because I think that at core, all of us crave those notions of fairness and equality, of dignity and respect. All of us crave a desire to be heard and seen. And oftentimes the poor and the marginalized do not feel heard, seen, or valued. And that is a further indictment on us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Judge. We'll stay right here. Does anyone have any questions for Judge Donald? Let me hand you this mic.
That was a little muffled.
That was muffled?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll hand you this. You need to give it back to him. Sorry. Hello, Judge.
Hello, Chloe.
I have a question for you. You're talking a story about going back to the gentleman who was really invested in your success and had staffed your courtroom with African Americans. When you said we need to have some diversity in the courtroom, what was his response to that? And I'm just curious because I know now when we say there needs to be diversity, people usually assume that we want someone of color. So you want it to go the other way. How was that experience?
Well, here you go. At that time, that was pre my ABA days. So I lived in a world that was black and white. I didn't know anything else. From Mississippi. And so for me, since we had a courtroom that was all black, they've been bringing some white people in. And so because Mr. Goldsby was my friend and he was a person who was genuinely concerned and open, he was very receptive. And when we changed that out, he did not see that as an indictment against him. It was sort of like a blind spot. And he was receptive and we made the change and we went around. We continued to be great friends. He continued to bring me cantaloupe because he grew those and other vegetables and things in the summer. So yeah, we were great. And not everybody is receptive, but he was a really wonderful person.
Right here.
Oh my God.
Uh-oh.
You're down here.
I've been down to see you. How are you?
I just want to tell you all, this is one of the most powerful speakers that I have ever heard. Yeah, and he's a true champion of civil rights and equity and diversity, but I didn't know you'd come west.
I'm hanging out here for the semester.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Denise. Judge, I'm going to take advantage of the fact
Okay,
that,
go right ahead.
that you are now free from the judiciary, so to speak. American misses you on the Sixth Circuit.
Thank
At
you.
the EOC, we miss you on the Sixth Circuit for sure. But I'm going to ask you a hard question. and take advantage of the forum.
Yeah, ask me a hard question, I'll tag Patty.
Chris Howe, my friend, my brother Chris Howe knows that when you're in the federal service, you don't so much as take a cup of coffee from the management bar or the defense bar, anyone involved. Anyone who's been in federal service understands what the rules are. And certainly at a political point of view, not with ethics, single trip, every single speech that they gave and asked a lot of questions. Now you have the Supreme Court and you talk about the perceptions about the rule of law. And I think that in the bar, there's an enormous amount of concern about whether the Supreme Court is able to police itself, given the number of trips which many of the Supreme Court justices apparently routinely take. So that's my question.
Well,
And now that you're not on this, now that I think you can answer this.
in fact, I had something in the talk about that, I just didn't mention that, but the public does wonder whether or not the judiciary can police itself, and I think the public is increasingly making the determination that we can't. That there needs to be a code of judicial ethics that judges must bind themselves. And all judges in the federal system have such a code except the Supreme Court.
Supreme Court today just announced and promulgated a code of conduct, just today.
Oh, really? Okay. How about the press? Great. Well, I'm glad they
I
did.
didn't say what kind of a code.
But I know the ADA had just formed a task force or something to work on moving the court or trying to put pressure on the court to get that code of ethics. And it really is a point. You're right, because the rest of us, we can do nothing. In fact, I'll give you another story. When I was senior status, which means I have a reduced number of cases and, I don't have to have that full caseload. I called the ethics office because I was thinking about Joe becoming a mediator, and I called them and asked the office whether or not I said whether I could do a volunteer mediation for the state, the little county court for poor people who come in and they can't afford to pay mediation fees or get a mediator. And I told them I've just taken this course and I really want to go and apply my skills. And they told me, no, you may not do that. I said, but I'm not doing it for money. And they said, it doesn't matter. Money is not the issue. You are a federal judge and you may not go over and do a free mediation for a county court. You can only do it if it is at the request of a federal judge. Well, I thought, I really thought that was kind of crazy, but I did adhere to that ruling. But they're very strict codes, and I think it's important that we have those guardrails. And part of that, people think, well, federal judges are so powerful, they're this, and they are pretty powerful. But no matter how powerful we are, we have an obligation to do the work, to show respect, to manifest to be above the fray in all things. People cannot have the notion that we are political or partisan in our decisions. Because if we have that perception, that erodes and undermines confidence in the court, and we, the court, have no armies to go out and enforce our judgments. You remember in Brown, over in Arkansas, they sent troops, but the judge didn't do that. The executive branch had to do that. Once the judge pins that opinion, we can't go on Fox News or MSNBC and talk about why we ruled the way we did. Or we can't go to the local newspaper and talk about that. If somebody attacks us, okay, I'm not there anymore, but if somebody attacks a federal judge or even a state judge should not go and defend themselves in the press. You just have to take the hit, take the criticism. The bar can get on it and take it, but the judge can't go to the bar and ask the bar to go out and defend my decision. We can't do that. We just have to take it. So yeah, I think they should have a code, and thank you, Joel. They've announced that there's a code, and we'll see what it looks like. Yeah, because I don't believe that people believe that courts can police themselves. Okay. We have 10 minutes. Is there one
Any other
more?
questions?
This is your opportunity.
I don't have a question, but I'd like to tell people something they don't know about.
Can you use the mic? There's a.
That they don't know about Judge Donald.
Yeah, we want to hear.
She happens to be a master mediator. And while that is in and of itself important, for years, she was one of the lead people who we use to train federal judges, district and mag judges in the skill, magistrate judges, in the skill of mediation, a skill that they generally didn't have because status conferences was not mediation. But the beauty of having Judge Donald as one of the instructors was not only she was an expert in mediation, but she had a unique perspective because in mediation, as in litigation, depending on who is in front of you in terms of gender and race and who the mediator is, there are cultural and other kinds of different perspectives that most of the judges really weren't aware of. Because when I first started teaching the judges in the district judge orientation system, I probably did it for you, I started in '75. All the judges were like me, middle-aged white guys. There were no women, there were no African American, there were nothing. That obviously changed over time. But we still had to give experiential training, and it was because of Judge Donald, really, that we must have gone through 100, 150 judges over the years we did this.
We did a lot.
So I just wanted to remember.
We have a question.
Okay.
Hello, Mr. Donald.
Hello.
Thank you for your excellent presentation today. Just was wondering if you had one or two tips that students, staff, faculty can implement today to increase our own ability to understand other differences, cultures, or to reduce our own bias.
Thank you so much for that. Check will be in the mail. There are three things I would point to. First of all, Justice Breyer said that nurseries, I get his quote wrong, that nurseries are the foundation for democracy, talking about how important education is. One of the things we can do, first of all, is to just embrace difference. We don't come to these universities to just reinforce what we already know. We come so that we can expose in this laboratory of learning different ideas, share experiences, and that makes the environment richer. So the first thing I would say is learn each other's story. When you are in settings, don't just go and talk to the group that shares, your same commonalities, but branch out and learn somebody else's story. Because what you're going to find is that all of us have more in common that divides us, and just doing that in a non-judgmental way helps us to break down barriers and to be open to discussions. The second thing I would say is read and observe. I think learning, going through training, I'm not just hawking the book now, but if you take Chris's class, those of you who are students, I think that you will certainly learn a lot because it is a rich, rich class and it exposes people to lots of different professors, and all of us are the sum total of our life, of our learned and lived experiences. So the training. And then the third thing I would say is be willing to be open to having difficult and uncomfortable conversations. Be willing to be uncomfortable and never just look at someone and assume that they are what you have described them to be. The literature says that we make decisions about people in the first 7 seconds of encountering them. You know what I know about this young lady right here? Don't be worried. They know absolutely nothing. And if I walk away and I don't have a conversation with her, my brain will fill in information, it will assign information to her based on what I think people like her must be like. And if I never have a conversation with her, I will go away and have that as the foundational information that I'll base some decisions on. But if we have a conversation, I will actually learn, and she will learn about me and I'll learn about her. So that openness, while you're here on campus, you have an incredible opportunity to expand your horizons by learning each other's stories, having conversations around difference and commonality, and just really exploring how rich our culture is. Now, if we were doing an implicit bias thing, and then I'm not gonna take any questions after this, but I'm gonna tell you something. If I were to ask you, if I would go through a list of things, and I may have done this before, I would go through a lot of job, some of them are formal and others are not. I would go through it very quickly and ask you to think about, what came into your mind when I said, NFL quarterback, secretary, nurse, doctor, drug dealer, prostitute, escort, priest, and I'd go on with some others. CEO. And then I'd ask you, what came into your mind when I said, secretary? And I ask you, how many of you thought about a male? How many of you had that image come in your mind? And I wouldn't get generally any hands. I don't ask people what came into their minds when I said prostitute and escort. It's whether people thought about, or the images that were really different, because just because of the power of those words, we allocate them differently. And when I talk about CEO, only one time in all the times that I've done this, I ask people, how many of you thought about an African-American female? Never occurred to me. No, I didn't think about that. But you see, as long as we sort of operate on the information that we already have, and we don't expand that, we will assign and consign people to categories that may or may not apply to them. So it's an opportunity at this university, and as you go in your community, to really enlarge your circle, enlarge your learning, and to really learn about the best in people, and also to show them the best in you. Thank you.